Dr. Benjamin Hardy, welcome to the show today.
Dude, I'm pumped to be with you. Let's talk about
Well,
scaling real estate.
yeah, I mean, look, I'm so excited here. One of the books I talk about more than anyone else is Who Not How, which it almost seems like the beginning of a series for you in the books that you've written. And when 10x is easier than 2x, and now the book Scaling the Art, Science of Scaling. So I'm really excited to be here today because we are talking about scaling with real estate. And so for those of us who have not read Who Not How, what's the big idea behind it, and why do so many, entrepreneurs, real estate investors get it wrong?
I'll explain, and also I'm really excited for you to get passionate and intense because I know you are about why flipping and things like that are not scaling in real estate. So I'm really pumped to dive into that and explain the why behind that, you and I together. In terms of who, not how, it's a really simple premise. Although if I had written that book today, that book would be a lot more expansive. But that's why the science of scaling is there. But the singular idea there is that when people are trying to solve a problem, especially entrepreneurs, we've been trained by the world to ask how. And when you put all the pressure of how on yourself to do something, it generally leads to procrastination, decision fatigue, overwhelm, because you honestly don't know the how. If you knew the how, you would have done it. And so that's really the big concept there is that the default setting should never be how. As an entrepreneur, it should always be who. Like if I want to get something accomplished, don't ask how, just ask who can do that for me, right? That's like the basic premise, and it allows you to become a leader, create teamwork faster, learn how to delegate, and start creating results rather than overly worrying about who does it. There's a lot of psychology that needs to be implemented to fully apply that because a lot of entrepreneurs they struggle giving the how away because they feel like they're the only one who could do it. They have an ego, or they are too afraid of controller. They don't know how to trust. They don't know how to filter and find the right who's right. And so a lot of entrepreneurs they stay small and stagnant because they don't understand delegation and they don't understand partnerships.
And like, for example, with single family house investing, it's not nearly as important, right? Because everyone's somewhat familiar with living someplace, right? So the idea of looking on the MLS for a house or on Zillow, talking to a real estate agent, going for a loan, like all these things are fairly known. And this is why people, they just gravitate. There's no need for who, not how, right? And so when you talk about 10x is easier than 2x, right? When you say, okay, that's cool. Well, instead of you buying a $400,000 house, I want you to buy a $4 million property. All of a sudden,
Much better, much better.
well, it changes everything, right? It kind of your argument. All of a sudden, you're like, well, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do that, right? And so, how does that mindset shift? Like, what is required for someone to change their mind around now looking at something when you really want to scale? It kind of changes everything. It's that linear path that no longer really works, and that mindset and the tactics you use to buy a rental, for example, breaks down when you want to scale. In fact, if you want to try to maintain that mindset, that whatever you're doing before, you're not going to be successful with scaling, right? So how does that talk about how does one break out of that mindset so that one can start expanding their mind a little bit more?
Yeah, I've kind of explained it in terms of level one and level two entrepreneurship as I see it, and I'm just making this up as you're talking to me. But level one is where you actually learn how to apply who, not how, where you actually start delegating, even getting an assistant, getting an accountant, right? Like actually like having someone do your marketing. Like you're not doing everything. You're no longer, you actually start having hiring people and start building a team. That's a really big jump for people. Level two, and I'll kind of explain the science behind it, is when you start going for a real scale, right? And you start going for like you said, rather than going for hundreds of thousands, you go for tens of millions, hundreds of millions, right? You change the goal. Um, and that then forces you to start doing everything differently. And to kind of briefly explain the psychology behind it and the strategy behind it, uh, and why 10x is easier than 2x, and why scaling leads to the most efficient pathways. Everything in psychology, like the core foundation of psychology starts with time. Honestly, how you frame your time. And how that works in psychology is how do you frame your own past and how do you frame your own future? If it's not that complicated, but if you think about psychology, if someone hasn't framed their past well, right, say they've got childhood traumas or things like that, then what they're doing is carrying around a past that's crippling them, right? And that they're blaming. And so, like, the thing that people have to understand with time psychologically is that time isn't something that's separate from you. Your view of time, specifically of your own past and your own future, and of your own past self and your own future self, are the things literally shaping how you're operating in the world today. Um, and so getting good at reframing the past so that it's a tool rather than, a trap is very important, but far more importantly, and this is where a lot of the research in positive psychology, neuroscience has gone, but even written by Viktor Frankl himself back in Man's Search for Meaning, right? Viktor Frankl was talking about the concentration camps, him being a psychiatrist and a Jew that was taken by the Nazis and put in the concentration camps. He literally said that the only way that you could restore a person's inner strength while inside the concentration camps was to give a person a future goal. And so that was his whole point, was that without a goal to strive for and stretch for, the present loses meaning. And so that's really like the future is infinitely more important and infinitely more, I wouldn't call it infinitely, but it's 10x more important than the past. The past is valuable. It's something to learn from. It's very informative. But the future is really what shapes your present. And so to your point, if you're going for 400,000 a year, that being your future, that's going to shape your process in the present. That's going to shape viable pathways. If you move the goal to, I'm going to start just getting $4 million properties or $40 million properties, now a lot of the things that you were doing to go for 400,000, they become dead ends. They're no longer valuable anymore. And so you have to then go and find different pathways. And the pathways to getting to 40 million or 4 million are fundamentally different than the pathways to just flipping houses.
Isn't a lot of factors here is one of belief, right? Let's talk about belief, because if I don't believe that buying a $4 million property is something I can do, then I'm not gonna create a goal of a $4 million property. My goal is gonna stay buying $400,000 houses.
Here's what I have to say to that, and it's a very important question. I think that belief in advance is a cop out. One thing that Dan Sullivan said, and I love Dan, he has what he calls his 4 C's formula, right? 4 C's are first commitment, and then commitment leads to courage. And from courage, when operating from courage means you're actually trying something you don't know if you can do, right? You may hope you will succeed, but courage doesn't mean it's a guaranteed outcome, right? The third one is building capability. As you commit to something bigger than you've ever done before, and even bigger than you even know if you can do, and as you start courageously moving towards that or stripping out bad pathways from before, as you start moving towards that, you start to eventually start to build capability. That's the third C over time, confidence. And so the thing that Dan says, which I love, is he says, everyone wants confidence. No one wants commitment and courage, right? And so I think that one of the things I want to explain that makes it a lot simpler, because when I actually tell people I want you to make your goal 10 times bigger, but keep the same timeline. It's like if someone was like, okay, I want to have 20 houses under 20 rentals in the next 5 years, I say, all right, so keep the 5 years, although maybe we'll shorten that even, but let's just go same timeline, 200 properties. Then someone starts to stress out, right? And so the thing that's helpful is, first off, people want what you just said. I want to know the pathway. I want to have confidence and assurance that I'm going to get there. That's not how it works. You don't start with confidence. Confidence is a byproduct that's earned. You don't deserve confidence for a 10x bigger goal. What you deserve is commitment if you're willing. But here's what really helps is the future and the past, time psychologically shouldn't be seen as concrete realities. Instead, these things should be viewed as psychological tools, and especially strategic tools. And so the future is a tool. And even all goals are tools, right? Even setting a 10x or 100x bigger goal shouldn't be something that stresses you out. Instead, it should be used honestly from a rational perspective as a filter for making decisions. So as an example, just going back to the person flipping, if rather than flipping $400,000 houses, they say, you know what, I'm going to move towards $400 properties, $4 million properties, or even $40 million properties. Now, of course, they don't have the confidence or the capability to do that. They don't even know what they're doing. But if they use that as a tool and say, from now on, I'm only going to start filtering for $40 million properties and opportunities. If you do it as a tool, then you don't have to be so stressed, right? It's just there so that in the present, you can then begin analyzing your decisions. Oh, well, if we're going for 40 million in the next 2 or 3 years, we know that we can't go for these $400,000 properties. Those things are now filtered out, right? And so now we have to start looking for better pathways, better opportunities, better who's, better partners. And so if you just use it as a tool rather than a stressor, but a lot of people just have bad framing around goals. They set low goals because they don't want to be seen as failures. They have too many competing goals because they've attached too much emotion to it versus just using it as a psychological tool for filtering out bad options and filtering for new paths and partners. It's just a tool. Don't let it stress you out.
that commitment is oftentimes a big step, and because I talk to people all the time, and they're kind of just stuck where they are. They can't see themselves buying these $4 million buildings, right? They're just because they're asking a lot of how questions, and they can't
Good
commit to
point.
the.
Good point.
They can't commit because they have so much doubt. Why would you commit to a goal that there's no way I can ever get to? And so I find that this gap, and also what I observe when people do commit to it, those are the action takers. They commit to a path and they don't know exactly how they're going to get there, but they're committed to it. But the majority of people can never get there, right? How can one get them to this path of commitment, to this path of scaling and exploring these pathways you're talking about?
So for me, it always starts with a goal. And the goal is what always shapes the path, as well as the paths you stop taking, right? Um, I think it's really important psychologically just to know and realize, and people don't really realize this, that everything they're doing is based on goals already, right? So the person who's flipping properties, all like they have goals, including every property they flip. They don't might not be fully aware of it. Maybe their goal is just to get to a place of financial freedom, or to, prove to their parents that they're worthy, or to be better than other people. We all have our own reasons and our own goals. The first thing that's healthy is just to realize you're being driven by your goals. And so if we want to start improving who you are and what you're doing, let's set better goals and let's do it a little bit more consciously, right? So the 4 million or the 40 million is naturally a better goal than 400,000. It's a bigger goal. And the reason I'm saying it's a better goal is because it's going to force out bad thinking. You can get away with a lot of bad thinking with smaller goals. With bigger thinking, you're forced to actually be a little bit more honest. But again, I'm just saying you can do it as a tool. You don't necessarily need to be fully convicted in the beginning.
Mm.
Over time, as you get used to hitting bigger goals, you start to build confidence that there's probably a pathway to this goal, even if I have no clue how to do it. You can start to build that confidence. But in the beginning, you really don't need, like, let's just start with the goal and like use that goal as a filter to like look at your current business and just say the majority of your business is not really that effective if we're operating from a bigger goal. Like again, rather than the small goal. And so you can start to just use it to start to analyze everything you're doing. And then from there, if you want, you can start to be really honest and say, what would happen if I started letting go of these and started to look for those better opportunities?
That's a
Um,
good point. I mean, being clear about the goal and then reverse engineer. The goal is not to buy a house or a building. The goal is something else. It could be, hey, I want financial freedom. I need $10,000 per month in passive income or something like that. Well, okay, then reverse engineer. Commit to that goal. Commit to that goal.
But you also don't need 100% commitment in the beginning. I think that sometimes there's that whole burn the boats idea, which trust me, I love. But like commitment can also be like something that you build into, right? So like as you start to learn about this bigger goal and start to think about how it's going to reshape your business and reshape your process and your pathway, including the majority of things you're doing right now that are going to eventually fall by the wayside, you don't have to fully make the commitment this second, right? Like you can be thinking about it, studying it, researching it. And usually one of the biggest aspects of commitment is beginning to let go of things. I call it below the floor, right? The things that fall below the floor with the new and bigger goal. As you start stripping things out that you know are, they were useful in the past, but they're no longer useful in light of the new goal. As you start stripping those things out, you actually start to build conviction. You start to build commitment. You start to build because you're acting courageously, and that it's like a beautiful feedback loop. And so I think that it's a false idea that you have to have 100% commitment in the beginning. That might actually lead you to committing down bad paths. But you can grow in the commitment. You can start doing micro commitments, letting go of certain things, or like making small investments or learning or getting advice. And over time it starts to really build into a full scale commitment where you've let go of your old life and now you're fully mastering this new one.
It's a good point. So you don't need 100% commitment right up front. You need little micro commitments, and one of them maybe could be an open mind, right? And so we could then get into the book that you just released, The Science of Scaling, right? You talk about the whole mindset of scale. It's a really continuation in some ways from 10x is easier than 2x, and you're kind of taking it to the next level. What is the entire? You mentioned the floor. I think is a concept that is specifically in the book. What is the premise of the art, the science of scaling?
The premise is that if you operate with the right psychology and strategy, um, scaling 10x or even 100x or whatever in a very short period of time is very doable. And what I've heard from people who have read both books is that 10x is easier than 2x kind of gave you the why of scaling. This book actually gives you the how. Um, I think that this book gives more of the why as well, a lot more of the why on the psychology and the strategy side. Um, but to this point, no science-based and rigorous framework for scaling has ever been created. It was a huge hole in the market. And the reason why scaling is such a outlier event, very few business owners ever scale, is because they don't know why they should scale. And it does really improve their process. They also don't know how. There's just too much complexity. And so we've created a science-based framework that makes it that can make it consistent. Like you can actually scale if you apply the framework. I would argue if you actually do apply the framework, scaling is the natural byproduct.
Okay, so why should someone scale, right? Because the argument always like, what? Well, when is enough enough, right? And then so the argument is why scale, or why should you scale and just stay where you are, or just grow organically? Like why bother?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like asking, like an elementary school kid like why go to college, right? Or like why why asking like a basketball player like why try for college or pro? Um, First off, it's just a natural progression, right? And so having bigger goals forces you to become better, right? It forces you to serve better. If we're talking about business, scale is going to force you to figure out a better market fit, right? A better product, a better service, hopefully give better service to your client base, who you serve, right? To make a better dent in the world. And so it forces you in a lot of ways, if you let it, to have a better why, maybe a less selfish why. Maybe in the beginning you got in business so that you could provide for your own self, for your own family. But when you go for scale, yeah, you can be a massive beneficiary, maybe even a 100x beneficiary in terms of your own finances. But maybe you could actually go out and do some real good in the world, right? Maybe you could actually, and what scaling forces you to do is it forces you to actually stop being an amateur. Like it's like, this is a little bit of a different topic, but like I've often worked with people who have gone from college to pros in sports. And often people who are really excellent at one level fail to succeed at the next because um, they never make that shift from college to pro or from amateur to pro. Like you can honestly, you can flip houses and still be quite an amateur, to be honest with you. Like you
Mm-hmm.
don't have to be a pro. You don't have to like really dial yourself and get phenomenal. But if you're going for like real scale, you've got to like get systems and processes. You've got to really have really good teams. You've got to actually deliver well, or else there's no way you're going to scale, right? And so it forces you to actually get good at business. It forces you to actually deliver a good product. It forces you, to overcome your weaknesses and maybe even get good partners. So like it forces really good decision making. It forces good business, and in the end, if done well, I mean, I'm thinking about what's going on in America. Um, like economic growth is important, both to families, to economies, to nations. So scaling is essential. It's why people have such great lifestyles today in the US. If other people hadn't scaled, I wouldn't be wearing this shirt. I wouldn't be using this phone. We wouldn't be on the internet, right? And so we're pretty blessed by the people who did choose to scale.
So what's the your process for scaling? Kind of what are the broad brushstrokes? If someone wanted to scale, you talk about the how a little bit. Kind of what does that look like?
Yeah, so the scaling framework, as I mentioned, is three levels. It's frame, floor, and focus. So those are the three levels. The frame is fundamental psychology. Everything we do is based on our own frame. So even people listening to this, the only reason that they're listening to your podcast is because for some reason or another you fit within their frame, right? Maybe they're trying to grow in real estate, right? Because yours is a real estate podcast. If they weren't trying to grow in real estate, guess what? They would not be listening to this podcast, right? It would not fit in their frame, right? You wouldn't even show up on their radar, right? Everything we see is in our own lens, our subjective lens. And the thing that's really important for people to understand with frame is that everything about our frame is figuring out and finding pathways to our goals, right? Some people would call that signal versus noise. Pathways that are relevant to goals are considered signal. Pathways that are irrelevant to goals, right, are considered noise, right? And so everything we're doing is filtering for what we consider signal to the goals or to the future that we want. And another really crucial thing to understand, and which you and I have already been hitting on, is that the frames that we have, or the core frame that we're operating from as people, is based on our goals, right? This is just essential human nature. And so your goals shape your frame. Your goals shape what you see and the pathways forward you take. And so an essential aspect of scaling is setting much higher goals and even more urgent goals, right? So to the real estate person, right? Maybe their goal is that I want to make $1 million a year, right? Or I want a business that's doing X amount of sales per year. If it's a small goal, then there's going to be a lot of potential pathways and a lot of noise and a lot of complexity in the business. And so the first step of scaling is actually like setting a scale goal, right? So maybe your ambition was to do 10 million in sales a year, right? What would happen if eventually you're doing 1 billion in sales a year, right? How would that change, or even 100 million? How would that change your frame? How would that change your pathways? How would that how would that change? And so the first step is frame, the second step is floor, which I've already mentioned. But when you start going for much higher goals, naturally the floor goes up, meaning that a lot of the things you could do for the lower goal, those pathways start to go away. Um, the example I did actually give of this in 10x was my son Caleb as a tennis player, right? So if he wanted to go for college tennis, us living in Orlando, there's hundreds of pathways for him to play college, right? He could play, he could go to 100 of the academies that are around us. But if you want to go for pro, most of those coaches now fall below the floor, right? Most of those pathways become dead ends. They can't get him to the goal. And so the beauty of setting the much higher goal and even the more urgent goal is that it forces out all bad thinking, and it forces you then to start filtering and finding, which is what I call focus. Forces you to start filtering and finding much better paths and much better partners that can actually get you to the goal. So that's
It's
the
like,
framework in very simple terms. There's a
yeah,
lot of depth to it as you go.
you're absolutely right, right? If you're like, oh, I want my son Caleb to go to college, there's multiple different ways you can go. But if pro, there's probably a very small number of coaches that have successfully gotten people to the pros. So why am I talking to other coaches that don't
The
have that kind
higher
of track
goals
record?
forge much more aggressive filtering.
More aggressive filtering, which also simplifies things.
100%. Forces you to be a lot more honest. I mean, one of my good friends who's a billionaire, he said that the reason entrepreneurs don't scale is because they're lying to themselves, right? When you said it's simpler, it is simpler because the first step of simplicity is saying these are all the things that don't work. So Michael Porter, who he was a Harvard guy, but he invented the field of competitive strategy, like back in the 80s. But he said that the essence of strategy is what you don't do, right? Even Steve Jobs said focus. Steve Jobs said a lot of people think that focus means, choosing what you say yes to. He said focus is fundamentally about what you say no to. He's like you gotta say no to 1,000 things in order to innovate, right? And so um, the first aspect of simplicity is about having a frame or a goal that's so high that it simplifies your current life, meaning that the majority of what you're now saying yes to goes below the floor and you have to start saying no to it. And a lot of people aren't willing to do that, right? In real estate, a lot of your audience, even if they set the 10x or 100x bigger goal and gave themselves 2 or 3 years to do it, the hard part would be raising their floor and simplifying and saying, all these deals that I'm doing, these $400,000 deals, which give me like a 20 or, like a, I don't know what commission you get, but whatever it is you do. Um, all these things are noise that are slowing me down. And like, yeah, I can make a decent living, but I'm not going to scale here. And the longer I keep saying yes to these things, the more I'm lying to myself about my potential.
Okay, how does that look like, that lying? Because I wanted to ask you about that. It's the second time you mentioned it. How do entrepreneurs lie to themselves, and how does that hold them back?
Yeah, so you lie to yourself when you go below the floor. You lie to yourself when you say yes to things, people, opportunities, situations that are holding you back from your goal, right? And so people lie to themselves all the time. They say yes to deals, even though they know that it's a short-term win, it's a long-term loss, right? Like that's a great way of saying that's how you lie to yourself. It's a short-term win for a long-term loss. If you're still, doing things in your business, including having team members or partners or whatever that are just like they're holding you back, right? Every time you maintain these things or continue to engage in these things, you're lying to yourself. And all of these things stop scaling, right? They stop you from growing. They're essentially you repeating cycles and not learning your lessons, right? And so what basically my definition is every time you go below the floor, meaning you're operating based on your past, but not on your future, you're lying to yourself. You're contradicting yourself and you're holding your growth back. And every time you start to strip those things out, even like those little deals that you used to say yes to, right? Whenever you stop that, meaning you've raised your floor and you actually stop it, now you're living in more alignment with your future. And that's going to lead you to much better and faster growth.
Yeah, interesting. So, okay, someone's really fired up right now, and they're like, I want to set my impossible goal. Like, what's the next step? What does someone do?
Um, I mean, I hate to say this, but like definitely like listen to or read the book, The Science of Scaling, right? Like it'll give you more depth. But to just talk about goals a little bit, you don't need a perfect goal. As we've already talked about, a goal is a tool, right? And so there's two very effective ways to make your goal seemingly impossible. And I lay out all the research on impossible, not all of it, but I lay out a strong amount of the research on impossible goals in the book. Um, but you want your goal to seem impossible because you if you don't know how to achieve it initially, what that allows you to do is it first requires that you start shattering some of your assumptions. And secondly, it forces you to start letting go of your old models and your old habits and your old paths because those won't work, right? And so the two ways to make a goal seem impossible are either just to scale it and make it bigger, and or to bring the timeline forward like dramatically. So let me just give an example. There was a young man who I interviewed while writing the book, and he's 22 years old. 22, and he wants to own a European soccer team, right? One day. And like it's awesome. But like this is where using the right framing of goals really helps. Because in his case, he wanted to own a European soccer team, and I asked him when, right? Because we always use time as part of our core framing. And he said, I will do it by age 55. I said, okay, that seems very reasonable, right? Because
Yeah.
that's such a big goal. It's going to take you 33 years to accomplish it, you being 22. And so I just said, what would happen if you move the time frame forward to rather than being 55, you'd be age 30, right? You give yourself 7 years. And that's when he started to like really start to say, but that's not going to work with my current path, right? We start to get really attached to pathways and processes. They actually call that Goodhart's law in statistics. Goodhart's law says that when a measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. And so like basically when you start overly focusing on inputs rather than outputs, the output for him is owning the European soccer team. Who cares what the inputs are? Let's figure out the right inputs. But for him, he started to say, well, there's a lot of things that I have on my 33-year path that are really important. Like one day I want to get a PhD. I want to run a firm. Like there's a lot of things that I think I need to do in order to get to the level where I can maybe deserve or be qualified to own a soccer team. I said, well, what would happen if you just move the timeline forward to age 30? How much of that path falls away? And one of the things that Elon Musk talks a lot about is false commitments or well, he doesn't call them false commitments. He calls them false requirements. In psychology, we call them false commitments or hidden commitments. Um, but the main point here is if you have your goal too far away, then you're not really ever really solving for the goal. You're solving for the next incremental step. So in his case, because he believes that getting a PhD is an important step in his journey to one day owning a European soccer team, which it's not, um, right now he's not even solving for the goal. If his goal is to own the European soccer team, he's not solving for the goal. Guess what he's solving for? He's solving for how do I get into a PhD program, right? And that has nothing to do with how do I effectively get a European soccer team. And so so one of the main things is have a bigger goal, and the other one is move the timeline so far forward that it forces out all of your false and hidden requirements, all the false steps that you've placed upon yourself. One other just quick example, and that is a friend of mine who he had a 10-year goal to scale his legal firm to 100 million. At the time, he was doing 2.5 million in revenue. But when I told him just move your deadline forward, I'm fine with your goal. It's a scale goal. 100 million revenue is huge. Like that's cool. Let's just move the deadline to 3 years. It looked like he's a cool guy. He's like actually applies this stuff. And so he's like, okay, I'll try it. Once he moved the frame forward, right? All of a sudden he realized, oh my gosh, I was never solving for 100 million. I don't even know what it means to create a $100 million firm. What he was solving for, because his goal was 10 years away, he was solving for how do I get to 5 million, right? Because again, he was at 2.5. And going for 5 million means that he can make a lot of bad decisions about who he hires, who he works with. Whereas if he moves the timeline forward and he actually has to start solving for 100 million, now he's got to create a pathway and actually start to build a business towards 100 million. And that's not the same pathway as to get to 5 million. Two totally different paths. And so just again, how do you set a goal? If you already have a massive scale goal, just move the timeline forward. 10 years is arbitrary. If you don't have a scale goal, actually set one. If you want to get to a certain level, make it 10 or 100x bigger, but make the timeline short as well, because that's going to force out all bad thinking.
So this lawyer friend, what difference decisions did he make once he realized the fact that he was solving for a $5 million company? What did he do?
Everything. What happened was, so in less than 90 days, he his whole business looked different, right? Because this is a really other important point, which we didn't get to, which I'm grateful you asked the question. Not only do your goals shape your psychology, which I'm calling your frame, floor, and focus, but your goals also shape the systems you build, including the business model you have and the systems you have, right? Um, and so even Grant Cardone, who's talked a lot about 10x, he didn't used to talk about it this way, but now he is, which is a good thing. He's saying like when he was going for 100 million in net worth or something like that, when he had an advisor say, dude, actually 10x it, go for $1 billion. one of his resistances to that was is that he realized his model could get to 100 million, but his model couldn't get to a billion. And so the goal shapes the system or the business model. In the case of Xavier, who you're talking about, the attorney, when he moved his goal forward from a 10-year goal to a 3-year goal, because now the goal was so close, it forced him to raise his floor. It forced him to really analyze his existing system and his existing business. And he realized that it was never going to scale. Like it was very inefficient, very clunky. One of the, like he started to like begin to analyze his, and none of this he was doing before. Like the greater time frame forces awareness, or the shorter time frame. And so like he realized that like his sales team was really inefficient. They were like producing at like 30%, some metric, and that he needed to replace them. Like within 30 days, he replaced them with a new team that was doing like 90% conversion on some metric of getting like booked calls or something like that. He found all sorts of inefficiencies in his business that he would have never been looking for had he not moved the timeline forward. He also, in light of the bigger goal, he brought on a general manager who was just what we call a super who, right? To the idea of who, not how. And that who within 90 days brought on 3 new attorneys. And the main thing is that in addition, so basically within 90 days, their revenue went up 30% and their profitability went up 50%. But if you fast forward like 7, 8 months, there that was last year. That was Q4 of 2024, right? That was those 90 days. And again, he was going for 10 million in 10 years, or sorry, 100 million in 10 years. Now that he's moved it forward and he's actually began to clean up his system and actually began to figure out how do I get to 100 million, including stripping out the majority of what they're doing. Like one of the things that he realized was that they were practicing like 10 forms of law. Most of them were very unprofitable and things that they would never become masters at. And so they actually stripped out all forms of law that they were doing except for like 3 or 4 that they were going to become like world class at. But where he's at now, and it's only been like 8 or 9 months since all of this began, they're tracking towards maybe 10 to 15 million revenue this year alone. So like within less than a year, they'll jump from 2.5 to 10. But more importantly, they're actually systemizing a process that can get them to 100 million within 3 years, and they will do it. He's adamant, he's clear, he's convicted, and he's one other thing that's happening is because now that he's going for 100 million, and to the idea that your filter shapes the pathways and the partners, he's now started to join communities of people who have already broken that $100 million range, and now he's starting to get mentors that know exactly how to do it and can plug him into pipelines that can do it. He would have never been doing that or even been engaging in various communities if he was going for, again, back to his old goal, which was 5 million. So it changes everything when you start to raise your frame, your floor, and your focus. Very quickly, do you start to find people and pathways and partners that can like expedite your results fundamentally. And this was something that I didn't teach in Who Not How, but it's something that I wish I had taught, and I just therefore taught it in the science of scaling. I didn't even teach it in 10x is easier than 2x because I wasn't fully aware of it. There's certain things you just learn more and more with time and with lessons. But when it comes to scaling, the 80/20 principle or the power law really applies. And that applies to people and partners. One of the things that Bill Gates said is that a really great code writer, speaking about like software code, is not worth 100 times, but worth 10,000 times an average code writer, right? And so if you think about the power law, like the S&P 500 is like there's 7 main companies in there that account for more than millions of companies, right? Really good books sell 1,000x or 100,000x more than the average book, right? So with scaling, the same principle applies that there are super who's out there, that's why I'm calling it like level 2. Like level 1, you just start hiring people. Level 2, you have a real scale goal and you have to start partnering with people who have leverage and can actually move you 10 or like a single who can 10x or 100x your business in terms of a partnership. And so those are the ones you really want to start finding. And once you actually start committing to the impossible goal and you start letting go of the stuff that's holding you back, you will start finding really unique partnerships and paths. I'll just say one. Because I was so committed to this book being really successful, I started like thinking, again, you always want to think from the goal rather than to the goal. But one of the things I really started thinking about was like, how do I make sure that the science of scaling blows up? And so I started thinking about like who would ensure that this book could succeed. And like a bunch of people started popping into my head. So I just started like, trying and potentially failing. And one of those people was Tony Robbins. And it just so happened that when I sent him the book, he happened to be in the hospital. And so like, you could call it divine providence, whatever, but he was in a spot where he could actually read it and he fell in love with it. And so he then requested to write the forward to it. And so like things can happen when you begin operating from a much higher goal and you can start to really find interesting pathways and people that can really expedite your process if you're willing to. And if you're willing to stop going below the floor and lying to yourself and saying yes to stuff that's dead end paths.
It's interesting when you compress your time frames like you're talking about. Like, let's say, hey, I want enough passive income so I can quit my job, and I want it in 10 years. That's path number one, right? And then, hey, look, I want it in the next 12 months. The initial path that led to that first goal
Doesn't work.
doesn't work at all. Like literally, it's like, oh, this is not going to work. And then interestingly, there is a path that would work somehow, but it forces you to throw out your initial path and then asks you the question, who can help me achieve that? I think it's just so powerful. And so, basically what you're saying, there's so much more in your book, The Art of Scaling. And where can people find this book?
Oh, so yeah, so it's the science of scaling. But one of the things, so yes, if you, by the way, my publishers allowed us to give it away for free. So if you just go to scaling.com/audiobook, you can just opt in and get the free audiobook, the whole audiobook, including Tony's Ford. But one of the things you just said, which is so key, and this is why I said use it as a tool rather than, is like, honestly, if you just took your 10-year plan and you said, how do I achieve it? And we use examples, by the way, in the book. We share people's plans. They were so committed to a 10-year plus goal. And I said, what if you just did it in 12 months? Initially, they didn't believe it was possible, but then they started to start reverse engineering better paths and they succeeded, right? And so to your point, I love just saying, if you took your 10-year goal and you said, how do I achieve it in the next year? Would your current 10-year plan work or your 10-year path? And they'd say, no. It's like, okay, so do you think we can find a path? That I don't know, but there would be a different path. Okay, now we're talking better strategy, right? If you took your current goal, say it's even a 12-month goal, and you said, what if you kept the same timeline? It's 12 months, but you 10x the goal. Would your current path work? The obvious answer is no. So, again, in psychology, we call it pathways thinking. You could think of it as strategy, but another part of it is what's called psychological flexibility, which is just the ability to let go of the old path, right? That young man, if he's willing to let go of the PhD, think about how much more he could have, or think about how much more aggressively he could find that. And I'm not going to tell him who his future self is. I'm just saying the goal should shape the path. The path shouldn't be set in stone.
That's right. You got to be able to let go of that path.
Oh, and to your final point,
yeah,
if you have higher goals, who not how becomes essential. Higher goals require who's and more leverage who's. You can't get to high and intense goals and scale without who's. So the higher the goal, the more intense the scale. Who becomes everything. If you want low goals, you can still focus on how.
Love it. So much fun jamming with you about scaling. Where can people connect with you?
The easiest way truly is just scaling.com/audiobook, bro. Like, honestly, like that's the easiest way.
Perfect.
You get access to the book. You can always just like email from there.
Yeah, I love it. So I'll check out The Science of Scaling by Dr. Benjamin Hardy. Great to have you on the show today.
Michael, dude, dude, good luck to you, your podcast. And to those who are listening, listen to Michael.